everyone, I hope you're all doing really well. Today I'm going to be sharing with you my favorite shade from each of my eyeshadow palettes. I own 21 eyeshadow palettes, and so we're going to be picking 21 of my favorite eyeshadows from my collection. I recently saw Sophie Alexandra do this video on her channel, and it reminded me that I have been wanting to do a new version of this because I did this video a couple years back, actually in collaboration with my friend Tosh, Too Much Tosh here on YouTube, and I need to redo it because some of those palettes are not a part of my collection anymore. My taste has definitely changed, and the audio on that video was horrendous. It's also been over 2 years since I did that video. So yeah, we're gonna be doing a new version of this with some new eyeshadow palettes that are in my collection, and this way you guys can see also all of my current eyeshadow palettes. I did consider sharing with you my palettes in terms of ranking, going from my least favorite to my favorite eyeshadow palette and sharing my favorite shade within each of them, but that just seemed really complicated, and to be honest, I cannot seem to figure out how to rank all of my eyeshadow palettes yet. I just can't. Like, I can't pick favorites. Eyeshadow is just my favorite category of makeup, so I can't pick favorites, but an exercise like this is definitely going to help me figure that out so that eventually I can give you a palette ranking video on my channel. But in any case, let's just hop into talking about all my favorite shades in my collection. I figured I would kick off this roundup with my ABH Modern Renaissance palette because this is currently in my Shop My Stash. This is a beautiful warm neutrals palette with a couple cool tones and some pops of bright-ish colors. My favorite shade in this palette is hands down this shade right here called Burnt Orange. I do have pretty significant pan on it, and that's not because it was ever a part of a project pan. It's just because this is the shade that I tend to gravitate to most naturally whenever I reach into this palette. It works as a great transition kind of shade, and it's a perfect one and done kind of shadow look as well. I've worn it a handful of times just as an all over lid shade, and I feel like it adds a little bit of drama, like a little bit of emphasis to my eyes without being super dramatic. I just think it's such an absolutely stunning eyeshadow. It's a matte shade, but I feel like it still really does something interesting for my eyes and for my coloring just in general. There is a swatch of it right there. It's definitely very neutral, but it is so beautiful and really quite versatile. This next palette is also currently in my Shop My Stash. This is the Catrice X Iman eyeshadow palette. This is a beautiful little 9-pan, again, very neutral palette, but I feel like these bronzy, coppery, warm tones are so beautiful and very flattering on my complexion personally. I did get this last year in like the late fall, and I used it so much when I first got it because these colors are just so nice for a little bit of drama and a little bit of warmth. My favorite shade in here is definitely, well, I don't know. Now that I'm looking at it, I know which one I reached for the most last year when I would use this palette quite frequently was Laguna, so I think I'm going to stick with that. Laguna is this beautiful coppery metallic shade. It is just so phenomenal, and I just feel like I can wear this with just about any look. Not any look, but like in any sort of instance, you know what I mean? Maybe because of its placement, my eye is drawn to it, but that color is just so nice and totally my kind of thing. I feel very comfortable in those kind of coppery shades. For the rest of these palettes, I'm not going in any particular order whatsoever. I'm just going to reach into my palettes and just pick whatever one kind of catches my eye next. So the next one is going to be my Melt Cosmetics Smoke Sessions palette. Such a beautiful green and golden palette. This palette is just such a dream. I love it so much. I love looking at this palette. I love playing with this palette. I feel like I get so many different fun looks out of this, and I feel very inspired by this palette. It is so hard to pick a favorite because the metallics in here, there's something just so special about them. They are so high impact and so damn delicious. But I think the color that my eye is always drawn to and I want to incorporate into so many looks is this shade right here called Sweet Tooth, which is a blue-based green shade. It definitely has a hint of turquoise to it, and it's a extremely high impact metallic. It's quite chunky actually when you put it on your finger, when you use it with a finger, but it is a dream. Look at that. Look at Sweet Tooth. That color By the way, I think a lot of these shades are gonna be browns and greens. Like, this is a very good indicator of what the rest of my color story is gonna be, because those are just the shades that I'm feeling at this moment, and I feel like I'm always drawn to browns and greens. But Sweet Tooth is such a beautiful color, and I just love this palette so much. I'm so happy I decided to finally pick this up after like lusting after it for almost a whole year. It's such a beautiful, beautiful palette. This next palette is the Blush Tribe Blossom palette, an all mattes, mostly bright eyeshadow palette. I feel like this is a really good palette to use as a companion palette to just about any sort of shimmer eyeshadow or liquid shadow. So beautiful. But Blush Tribe is no longer a brand. They have kind of rebranded, and I've never really had kind of interest in Blush Tribe, to be honest. It's not really a brand that caught my eye, but this was a declutter from my friend Alexi, and she sent this to me, and it is actually a favorite of mine. I do really enjoy this palette. I just never really kept up with Blush Tribe or what they were doing, to be honest. So in any case, let's talk about my favorite shade in this palette. As you can see, I do have 3 pans in this palette. They are all from my Panless eyeshadows, so that's not an indicator of my favorite shades in here, because those were shades that I had randomly drawn. But in all honesty, I'm gonna have to go with the green, guys, because every time I use this palette, I'm really happy with the way that these shadows all blend. But most of them are quite sheer. They take a little bit more building, whereas the shade Clover right here is something that I feel like just instantly has tons of impact and pigment. I've used this as a one and done all over my lid and lower lash line kind of shade, and I had so much fun with it. And every time I reach into this palette, this is the shade that I really want to integrate into looks, so I'm going to definitely have to pick that as my favorite. And here is what Clover looks like. It's just this beautiful, like Kelly green matte shade, and it is so beautiful. As you can see, it has so much pigment. In comparison to some of the other shades in this palette, I feel like it is one of the better formulations, even though I don't know how easy green is to formulate. There's something about this, they did a really great job with it. This next palette is my always and forever grubby. I feel like I always have to point that out because I'm super embarrassed by the state of this palette, but it is the Fenty Beauty Galaxy Palette. This was the holiday palette that Fenty did the first year that the brand came out. And I am working on one of the shades in this palette in my Panless eyeshadows. I'm trying to figure out how I'm gonna show you guys the inside of the palette without showing you my progress on that shade, and I'm kind of struggling. So why don't I hold it like this, even though I haven't been holding any of the other palettes on this side. The one that I'm always drawn to whenever I open up this palette is that orange right there, for sure, but I haven't used it enough. I really don't think that I've used it enough to really say it's an absolute favorite. My eye is always drawn to that color. But actually, I would say that my favorite shade in this palette is that purple right there, which is called Space Out. I had it in my Panless eyeshadows last year, and I fell in love with that color. I feel like I was able to pair it with so many looks, and it was really fun. I don't tend to love purple eyeshadows. I feel like it's one of those shades that I kind of am drawn, like, I'm not drawn to, is what I'm trying to say. But this shade had so much shimmer in it, and it was kind of like a slightly smoky kind of purple, and it just had so much dimension with all of that shimmer. I just think it's such a beautiful shade, and I really fell in love with it through my Panless eyeshadows, so I definitely have to pick it as my favorite in the palette. This next palette is the Sleek Eye Divine Perfect Storm palette. This palette, I feel like I just tend to overlook. I don't tend to reach for it very often. It's not because I dislike the color story, it's probably just because this palette is quite small, so I don't really tend to see it in my eyeshadow drawer, but also because the packaging is all black, I just tend to not remember to reach for it. It's something that doesn't super inspire me from the exterior, and that's super important to me, so that is definitely something that holds me back from reaching for this palette as much as I probably should. But in any case, whenever I do reach into this palette, for some reason I have to pick out this shade right here, which is called Snowstorm, and I would choose this as my favorite in this palette because just look at it in the swatch. It is so high shine, and it's such a fabulous, like, highlight kind of shade. I can wear this over the lid with a bit of a matte in the outer corner and in the crease, and I feel like this really just brightens up my eyes, and as an inner corner highlight, it is so gorgeous. And when I'm at my fairest, this is a really nice face highlight as well. This just is a beautiful champagne-y, almost white gold shade that I just feel like pairs with so many different looks and can be worn in so many different instances. I just think it's so beautiful, and it's really where my eye goes as soon as I reach into this palette. This next palette is my Kat Von D Shade and Light Eye palette, which is my Pan That palette for 2020. If you don't want to get a spoiler for this palette, or for my next update rather, then I would suggest skipping ahead just a couple seconds. But this is what the inside of the palette looks like. It is an all matte neutrals palette, and it really is a good like basic palette to add as a complementary palette to any look, or of course you can use all of these neutrals just on their own to create a wide variety of different neutral looks. My favorite shade in this palette, hands down, is this one right here called Ludwin, which is almost empty at this point. It's a peachy orange shade, and I feel like this palette as a whole is kind of missing more of these light transition shades. And this shade is just perfect to use as a transition, but I also love to use it actually as a blush as well. At this time of year, it's not the best blush on me. I do use it, but in the fall and winter, I just feel like it's so perfect. You can't even see this swatch. But when I'm at my fairest, this is a little bit more peachy, a little bit deeper on me, and then it is just a perfect bright and just fresh looking blush shade on me during that time of year. For now, it is just a really good transition or like kind of starter shade for a look. I think it's fabulous. I also really love wearing this on my lower lash line just to add a little bit more definition to my eyes without being anything sort of over the top or super dramatic. But yeah, that's my absolute favorite shade in that palette, and I wish there were more shades that were that kind of tone, especially since I am panning it that this year. I feel like I have been kind of missing those kinds of shades all intermingled with a lot of the deeper shades in the palette. The next palette I want to talk about is my beloved Melt Cosmetics Gemini palette. She is just so beautiful. This palette is everything to me. I just love it so much. Oh my gosh. Every time I look at this palette, it just fills me up with joy. I feel so excited to use it, and I just create the most amazing grungy shades that I just feel so comfortable and confident in. My favorite shade in this palette is so hard to pick. It's so hard to choose. I'm like, do I want to go down to the warm neutrals or do I want to go up to the greens? But just looking at the palette, I can see that I have the biggest natural dip in the shade Fire OG, and I probably would be upset to not pick that as my favorite. I would probably go back on that decision. So I'm gonna choose Fire OG because this shade is really unique. It's a matte, swampy, olive kind of green, but it has a yellow base to it, and I just think there's something so special and so fun about it. And yes, the formula has quite a lot of fallout, but it makes it so it blends effortlessly and endlessly. And look at that delicious shade. Oh my gosh, that shade. It just makes my heart sing. It's so beautiful. I love it so much. This next palette is my ABH Norvina Volume 1 palette. This is also currently in my Pan Those Eyeshadows Project Pan. This palette, on first impression, is a pink purple palette. Also, I'm gonna try to cover up the shade that I'm working on, so I'm just gonna cover up that one called D1 there. Oh my gosh, this is so awkward. But on first impression, it's a very pink purple palette. I think the packaging really does kind of deceive you because there's basically every color in the rainbow in this palette minus greens. And through using D1, I have fallen absolutely in love with this shade right here called C2, which is a gorgeous yellow gold shadow. It's delicious. I feel like I've just been pairing it so much with D1 because it is just an easy pairing, but it is something super special and really not something that I would think would be a favorite from a palette that really gives me the impression that it's a pink and purple, very cool toned, very like girly kind of palette. It just has kind of this flaky sort of texture to it that is just so perfect, and it creates so much dimension on my lids, and I feel like it just is very, very, very impactful. It's so stunning. I feel like I'm gonna say the words versatile, impactful, and pigmented a lot in this video, If you want to make a drinking game out of it, I did not encourage that, but there is that option. This next palette is a little bit newer to me. This is the Catrice Insta Bay palette. I received this in PR and it is a really nice neutral palette with a couple pops of color, just that like kind of greeny gold and then more of a cranberry shade, but as a whole it generally is quite a neutral palette. I haven't played with it quite enough, but I have used all of the shades at least once, and I know that the shade that I'm the most drawn to and I've used the most times out of this palette is probably going to be my favorite shade, and it is this one right here called #trending. This is the shade right here. It's kind of like a rosy bronze, and as you can see in that swatch, it just like blends so effortlessly and it's absolutely so stunning. It has so much shine to it. I really feel like it is like an amped up neutral. This next palette is the Masquerade Mini by Juvias Place. This is one of my older palettes in my collection, but it's such a goodie. I absolutely adore this palette. Every time I look into it, even still, I'm so excited by all of the colors in here. I think it's a great mix of neutrals and colorful shades. It's just phenomenal. And the artwork on this is beautiful too. It's really, really hard to pick a favorite. I know I have to pick one of the colorful metallics up on the top because those are where my eye is always drawn to, and that's what really makes this palette very special in my opinion. But it's really hard. Ugh. I'm torn between Mali and this one called Makeda. Sorry, there's eyeshadow fallout on it. So Makeda. I think I'm gonna pick that one right there, the purple shade, the purple metallic called Makeda. I think I'm gonna pick that as my favorite because I have worn this so many times and I think it creates the most amazing looks and it's just beautiful. Look at that. It's like a classic purple, but it has this beautiful metallic finish and it just is so buttery and blendable. I've worn it so many times over the past few years that I've owned this palette and I love the way that it looks on my eyes. I feel like it actually, oddly enough, kind of brings out the green in my eyes and makes my eyes look more green versus brown. And there's something super special about this shade and this formula. This next eyeshadow palette is the Born to Run by Urban Decay. This palette looks mighty loved because it was in my Pan Those Eyeshadows several times last year and this year. This palette has just been panned by me so frequently. But in any case, one of my favorite shades in this palette, or my actual favorite shade in this palette, is one that you would never pick as a favorite from me, knowing that I love like bronzy, brown, green shades. But my favorite shade in this palette, because I have used it actually quite a lot and I'm always in love with the looks that I create with it, is this shade right here called Blue Sky, which is like a aqua metallic gray blue sort of shade. It is just so unique to my collection and that's why it makes it like feel so special in this palette, and it has to be my favorite because I feel like a lot of these shades I have them so many times over, but this one is just one of a kind and I can wear it with so many different types of looks and I've loved it every single time I've worn it. It's just so special. Look at it. It's like a kind of like a silvery shade, but then it has that blue shift to it and there's just something really unique and really gorgeous and special about it. I don't know how else to describe it. It just is so beautiful. This next palette is the Basic Bay palette by Catrice. It is full of basic neutral shades, but they are not basic in terms of their formula. I really think that this is an underrated eyeshadow formula because I think this is like $15 or $16 Canadian, and these really do feel like high-end eyeshadows to me. They're so good. The mattes are amazing. The metallics are very high shine and really pigmented, but the mattes are really what make this palette special to me because I feel like they just kind of blend themselves. So my favorite shade in this one, I have to say for sure, is this shade right here, which is kind of like a basic neutral, but it's the shade called #MOTD. I feel like this is just a shade that I want to integrate into so many looks because it really is, oh my gosh, I'm just like touching it. Oh my gosh, it's so buttery. And it it really is so beautiful and so easy to work with. And I think it really just performs like a high-end eyeshadow, and it just always wows me every time I reach into these mattes. And that shade is just so versatile, and it really is one that I think I integrate into many looks. And this next palette is the Magic Mini by Juvias Place. Again, one of my newer palettes, but I think I've had it for about 4 months now. And this is such a beautiful color story. I just feel like it's so well curated. I feel like this is just like a good standalone palette that you could create so many looks with without ever having to use any other palette. It's so phenomenal. Now I do have stickers in here. These are from the Elf and J Kissa palette, so I feel like I get asked that whenever I share this palette on camera, but that's what those are from. I just felt like they kind of fit the theme of this palette. But my favorite shade in this is so difficult to choose. Like every time I look at this palette, I feel like my eye is drawn to different color stories depending on my mood for the day. But my hands down favorite shade I think that I'm always drawn to and I always want to incorporate into looks is this shade right here on the top, which is a beautiful, bright, kind of antique gold shade. It's called Nubia. It is just so beautiful. And every time I swatch this shade, I'm like, so how can I play with this again? How can I make this work? How can I use this in another look like ASAP? It's so good. It's so good. Look at that. Also, these are going to be super, super rough on this arm because this is not my dominant hand. My left hand is useless, but in any case, this is my favorite shade from that palette for sure. This next palette is the e.l.f. Matte for Matte Jewel Pop palette. This is a mini all matte eyeshadow palette, which I feel like is just like perfect for fall. These shades are so good, and yeah, I really do adore this palette, but I feel like I don't reach for it quite often enough. Again, it's the same sort of thing. It's the all black packaging, very simple and very small palette, so it just gets overlooked by me. But every time I reach into this, I'm really impressed by it. I have not used every single one of these shades on my eyes, which is like kind of appalling because I think I bought this in fall of 2018 and I just have not used them all. But I must say my favorite shade in this palette is the mustardy shade. Every time I open this up, I want to create a beautiful like warm toned fall kind of look from this palette because of this shade. It's the perfect shade to just pop on as like a base, it's like kind of like a look starter kind of shade, and then the look will always develop from this shade. Like look at that mustard. It's a very like kind of dirty sort of mustard shade, and it's just perfect and it blends so, so well. Next up, we have my Anastasia Beverly Hills Subculture palette. This is the palette that I think really, really is quite polarizing. It kind of broke the beauty internet community for a while. It made everyone feel very disjointed because you either loved it or you hated it when it first came out, and I absolutely loved it. That's why I still have it in my collection. I find this so inspiring. I love the shade selection of this palette, and I feel like the formula, although difficult, is really, really impactful, and I just think it's a beautiful, dreamy palette to work with. I really enjoy it. My favorite shade in this palette is one that I've hit pan on naturally, and it's the shade Electric. There's something so special about this like golden green kind of shade. I just feel like every time I throw it on my eyes in my inner corner, on my eyelid, I just adore it. I feel like it's so special and it's just so good. Like, I don't know if you can see it from there. I don't know if you can see how special it is, but there's this green element to it. There's this like yellow kind of like limey yellow kind of shade almost. I don't know, like a neon yellow gold. I don't know how to describe it, but it is phenomenal, and I did hit pan on it just all on my own without a project pan because I can't seem to not wear this eyeshadow whenever I open up this palette. It's so good. This next palette here is the Nabla Soul Blooming palette. This is such a stunning, probably a little bit more cool toned palette. It's very pink and purple, but it is really dynamic. I feel like I can create quite a variety of looks using this palette alone. On first impression, you feel like it's very cool tone because of that purple packaging, that periwinkle kind of shade, but there actually are some beautiful warm tones in here as well. It's really, really, really versatile in my opinion. Well, actually, I should note though, I am wearing this eyeshadow palette mostly on my eyes today. I do have one other shade from a different palette on my eyes, but I am wearing this mostly because I just felt super inspired to reach for it today. But in any case, my favorite formula in this palette, although the metallics and like the more like chunky glitters are fun, these mattes, the first time I used this palette, I was like super impressed. It like blew me away. And every time I reach for this palette, it's just a reminder of how good these mattes are. So my favorite shade, although boring, it is this shade right here called Gia, which is a like rosy brown shade. It's what I have all over my lower lash line. I didn't even put on any mascara because I feel like it really gives me a very defined look, and I think it's just such a stunning shade. It has that element of like almost a corally brown. Is that a weird descriptor? I think so, but it is so special. It really is so pretty. Like, look at that. It's very rosy, and I'm not generally drawn to rosy kinds of shades, but this one, because it has such a like deep brown base to it, not deep, but it has a pretty severe brown base to it. I just think it's so special, and the formula on it is just impeccable. This next palette is the Soap X Revolution Extra Spice palette. This is a beautiful neutral palette, but it has like these hits of more playful color to it. I think it's a really good dynamic palette, and I think that it works for a lot of different situations. I will admit, I have not used some of these shades even still, which is wild because I've had this palette for like a year and a half at this point. But yeah, there's just some shades I just don't reach into. Maybe because I am always panning other eyeshadows, they're just shades that don't tend to get reached for, or they get overlooked. But whenever I look at this palette, my eye is definitely drawn to the metallics. I do think that the metallic formula in here is a little bit sheer. It's not the most impressive metallic formula, but in any case, I think this is my favorite shade in the palette right here, which is called Dreams. I reach for this very frequently whenever I do reach into this palette because it's that, you know, bronzy, coppery, metallic shade that I just think is so great to use for so many different occasions, and I think is just such a flattering shade on me. This next palette is the total opposite of the Soap X palette. I feel like this is the e.l.f. and Jisa To The Rescue palette. It's a beautiful rainbow palette that contains mostly mattes, but then a handful of metallics, and these metallics really, really, really are amazing to me. The mattes are really good and really blendable. I just feel like these shimmers are where it's at when it comes to this palette, and I struggle. I'm looking at this palette thinking I'm probably gonna pick the green, but to be honest, the first time that I used this palette, I used this shade Bailey, and I loved it. And I've used it a handful of times ever since getting this palette because I think it is just such a beautiful blue, and blue is not the shade that makes me feel very comfortable or confident, but something about this, it has a little bit of a purple kind of tone to it. Yeah, it's gonna be my favorite. There's something about this. It has a ton of like glimmer and shimmer to it, but I don't mean that in a bad way. I just mean it makes it look so foiled and so delicious and so smooth on the eyes, but it also just has so much shine, and it's such a beauty. It really is. This next palette is the Urban Decay Electric palette. This is currently in my Pan Those eyeshadows, but I'm sure you guys know the shade that I'm working on, I'm not gonna hit pan on anytime soon, if ever. So this is what it looks like on the inside. This is the oldest eyeshadow palette that I have in my collection. I have had it for absolutely forever, but I still find this palette really inspiring, and I really love looking at this palette and using this palette. My favorite shade in this palette kind of changes depending on my mood, but my current favorite in this palette is this shade right here called Thrash. It is like this acid green that is just so grungy and bright, and it's just amazing. I love using this on the inner corner. I love using this to like blend out other greens on my lid. I just think it's something that works in so many different instances, and I love that it gives my looks this grungy element that just is so good, so good. And this last palette is the Juvias Place, the Zulu palette. This is one of my favorites in my collection, and it is currently a part of my Pan Those eyeshadows, so I'm gonna cover up that matte orange in there. It's not my favorite shade in this palette anyway, so within the remaining 8 shades in this palette, my favorite shade, it's so hard to pick. I don't know how to pick a favorite in here, but I think Oh my god, I just got eyeshadow all over me. It just kind of crossed my arm onto myself. I got eyeshadow everywhere. Okay, anyways, the shade that I think is my favorite is either one of these two. I think I'm gonna choose the green just because I do tend to reach for it more often. It's like this beautiful, like tropical metallic green shade. There's a lot of green in this lineup, but that's because I love green. And this green is so, so stunning. Like, look at the shine of that. Look at that. It's so beautiful all over the lid. It's gorgeous as like a beautiful pop of color on the lower lash line. And actually, that wraps it up. That was my last palette that I had to talk about, palette number 21. So here we are with all of my favorite shades from all of my eyeshadow palettes. I feel like it's a little bit more diverse than I was originally anticipating, which is really nice to see, but there definitely is a theme happening in here. I think these shades are all so beautiful. They all offer something really unique to my collection, and that's what makes them my favorite, and that's what makes them super special. I do want to actually potentially do like a eyeshadow bingo using all of my favorite shades from my collection, because after Sophia Alexandra did her favorite and least favorite shades in her collection, she ended up actually doing a palette bingo, doing like one look with her favorite shades and one with her least favorite shades. And I think it would be really fun to do it with all of my favorite shades from my collection. So let me know if that's something that you would be interested in seeing. Give this video a thumbs up if you are interested in seeing it. Let me know down in the comments below as well. That is absolutely everything for today's video, though. Let me know if some of your favorites would be different than what I've chosen for my favorites. But yeah, that's everything. Thank you so much for watching, and thank you so much for hanging out with me. I hope that you're staying safe, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye, everyone.